There is a moment, just after loss, when reality feels slightly misaligned. The room looks the same. The walls haven't moved. The world continues with its quiet indifference, and yet something is unmistakably different. Not gone, just shifted, as if presence itself has changed its form, slipping just beyond the reach of your senses, but not beyond your awareness. Across centuries, across civilizations that never spoke to one another, a strange pattern emerges. A number repeats itself in rituals of mourning, in prayers whispered into silence, in the unspoken rhythm of grief. 40 days, not as a symbol, but as a process, a duration, a threshold. And what if this repetition is not tradition, but memory, something humanity once understood and then forgot? Edgar Cayce described this interval not as myth, but as a structured transition, a precise unfolding, not in some distant abstraction, but here, intertwined with the living. A sequence where consciousness does not vanish, but reorganizes itself, adjusting to a reality no longer filtered through the body. And within these 40 days, something unfolds that quietly reshapes both the one who has departed and the ones left behind. The beginning is not immediate. Contrary to what logic might suggest, the separation is not instant. For roughly 72 hours, consciousness lingers. Not trapped, not lost, but observing. A state of awareness without physical limitation. Imagine perception no longer bound by direction or distance. Vision that is not confined to the front of the eyes. Awareness that does not require sound to understand thought. Emotion becomes visible, almost tangible, moving through space like currents. In this phase, there is recognition, but not yet acceptance. A kind of cognitive dissonance occurs. The self knows something irreversible has happened, but the identity, conditioned by years of embodiment, has not yet aligned with this new state. There may be attempts to interact, to speak, to reach, to reassure, but the familiar rules no longer apply. And this creates what Cayce referred to as a sacred confusion, not chaotic, but transitional. A necessary pause between identities. This may explain why, in those first days after loss, people report subtle anomalies. A presence that feels specific, not imagined. A shift in atmosphere that cannot be explained logically, yet feels undeniably real. These are not necessarily hallucinations, nor are they easily dismissed as coincidence. They may represent the overlap of two states of awareness, briefly sharing the same space. Then, something changes. Around the fourth day, the mind, if it can still be called that, begins to reorganize. The resistance dissolves. Understanding begins to emerge, not through language, but through direct perception. And with this shift, another layer of reality becomes accessible, not imposed, but revealed. Entities appear, not strangers, but familiar in a way that bypasses memory. Recognition without recollection. Some traditions call them guides, others angels, others still describe them as extensions of consciousness itself. Cayce simply referred to them as helpers. Their role is not to instruct, but to accompany, to stabilize the transition as awareness expands beyond the limitations of physical perception. During this period, there is a dual awareness, the ability to perceive both the physical environment and this expanding non-physical landscape simultaneously. This is not symbolic, it is experiential. The funeral, the voices, the grief, all remain perceptible. But layered over this is another dimension entirely, one where thought is not internal, but generative, where intention shapes experience instantly. And there is a reason for this overlap. Closure, not in the emotional sense we understand, but in a structural sense. The psyche requires continuity. It must witness the conclusion of one state before fully entering another. This is why rituals exist, not merely for the living, but as anchors for the departing consciousness to orient itself within this transition. And within this fragile overlap, communication becomes possible, not through words, but through patterns, synchronicities, moments that seem too precise to be random. A song appearing at an exact second, a symbol repeating in unlikely ways. These are not direct messages in the way we expect, but they carry intention, meaning embedded in coincidence. As the days progress into the second week, something far more complex begins. The life review, not a judgment, not a trial, but an expansion of perception so complete that every moment of existence is re-experienced from all perspectives simultaneously. Not just what was done, but how it was received. Not just actions, but their consequences across time. A single interaction, once forgotten, now unfolds into a network of effects extending far beyond its origin. This is not punishment. It is clarity. The mind, freed from ego and defense, begins to see patterns. Why certain relationships formed. Why specific conflicts repeated. Why certain decisions felt inevitable at the time. The illusion of randomness dissolves, replaced by a structure that was always present, but never fully visible from within the limitations of a single perspective. And during this process, something interesting happens to those still living. Dreams change. They become vivid, structured, emotionally coherent. Encounters occur that feel less like imagination and more like interaction. The person who has passed appears not as they were in their final state, but restored, whole, calm, often carrying a sense of understanding that was absent before. These experiences are often dismissed as coping mechanisms, but their consistency across individuals suggests something deeper. If consciousness is no longer bound by linear time, then communication does not need to follow physical rules. It finds the path of least resistance. And for the human mind, that path is often the dream state. By the third week, the intensity of this process begins to shift. Healing begins, not in the physical sense, but at the level of identity. Residual emotional imprints, guilt, regret, unresolved tension start to dissolve. Not erased, but integrated. The psyche releases attachments that are no longer necessary. This is not passive. It requires participation, a willingness to let go of the narratives that once defined the self. And strangely, this internal process reflects outward. Those who are grieving may feel sudden, unexplained moments of peace, a lightness that interrupts the weight of loss, as if something has been released, not by them, but through them. This suggests a feedback loop. That connection does not end at death, it transforms, and shifts on one side influence the other. By the fourth week, the experience becomes less individual and more relational. Reconnection begins, not just with familiar figures, but with what could be described as a broader network of consciousness. Relationships that extend beyond a single lifetime. Patterns of interaction that repeat across different contexts, now visible in their entirety. What once appeared as isolated encounters are revealed as part of a larger structure. Recognition occurs instantly, not through memory, but through resonance. And from this expanded awareness, something flows back toward the living. Not messages, not instructions, but emotion. Sudden warmth, unexplained calm, a presence that feels specific and intentional. These are not random fluctuations. They are expressions of connection that no longer require physical proximity. Then, in the final phase, something decisive emerges. Choice. With the transition stabilized, consciousness is no longer reacting, it is directing. Paths become visible, not as destinations, but as trajectories. Some remain closer to the frequency of human experience, maintaining a form of connection that allows influence, guidance, subtle interaction. Others move toward states of learning and expansion that no longer intersect directly with the physical world. And for those still living, this is often the point where the sense of presence begins to fade. Not disappear, but become less immediate. This can feel like a second loss, a quieter one, less intense, but more final. And yet, it is not absence. It is distance created by expansion, like watching someone move beyond the horizon, not gone, but no longer within sight. The 40th day marks the stabilization of this transition, not an ending, but the completion of an adjustment phase, a recalibration of consciousness. And within this entire process, there is something that is often overlooked: the role of the living. Grief is not a disruption to this process, it is part of it, but its quality matters. When grief becomes fixation, when it resists the movement of life, it can create tension within this connection, not because it holds the other back in a literal sense, but because connection is reciprocal. It responds to the emotional state that sustains it. But when grief evolves into acceptance, not forgetting, not detaching, but understanding, it becomes something else entirely. Support, a form of alignment that allows both sides of the connection to continue evolving without resistance. This does not mean suppressing emotion. It means recognizing its direction. And perhaps this is the deeper implication of the 40-day cycle. It is not only about what happens after death. It is about what remains during life. The continuity of awareness. The persistence of connection. The idea that relationships are not confined to physical presence, but exist as patterns within consciousness itself. So the question is not whether connection ends. The question is how it changes, and whether we are aware enough to recognize it when it does. Because the boundary between presence and absence is not as clear as it seems. It is thinner, more flexible, more responsive to perception than we are taught to believe. And if you sit with that, not as a belief, but as a possibility, something begins to shift, not outside you, within you. A quiet recognition that what you feel may not be imagination, that what you sense in moments of stillness may not be empty, and that what you have lost may not be lost in the way you think. If this perspective lingers in your mind after this moment, then let it stay there, not as a conclusion, but as a question worth returning to. And if you choose to explore further, to look deeper into the patterns that shape consciousness, memory, and existence itself, then remain here, with this space, with this channel. Because some ideas are not meant to convince you, only to stay with you, until you begin to see differently.